It's obviously this enriched uranium business that moves back into the center of the discussion routinely. And in addition to that, that Iran cannot retain control of the Strait of Hormuz. Well, those are two insoluble problems from the standpoint of Iran. Iran sees both of those as inextricably intertwined with their national sovereignty and independence. So I think we can say with some certainty there's not going to be a deal. Forget it. The other thing is we aren't talking directly to the Iranians. It seems that people don't really get that, because Donald Trump conveys the impression, well, we're close to a deal and they're much more professional now, as though we have suddenly become professional. I can't conceive of anything less professional than the goons that we've sent over there to negotiate. At this stage of the game, I think we just have to wait until this war breaks into the open. And I think we're getting closer. And with this event of last night, it seems almost certain that we're going to go back to a hot war. If we could just divert a little bit away from what's really happening in the discussions to what I think are really far more serious issues that the president and his colleagues in Washington don't seem to understand or be facing.
Now pause for a second, because this is the part that should genuinely worry people. Trump says a deal with Iran is close. Iran says no deal is close. Washington says diplomacy is moving. But the oil market, the Strait of Hormuz, and the inflation numbers are telling a very different story. And that is the real danger here. Because this is not just about whether Iran gives up uranium. This is not just about whether Netanyahu gets what he wants. This is not even just about another war in the Middle East. This is about what happens when a superpower keeps talking like it controls the situation, while the economic foundation underneath it is already shaking. If this war restarts, the damage does not stay in the Persian Gulf. It hits oil, it hits diesel, it hits fertilizer, it hits food prices, it hits interest rates, and eventually it hits ordinary families who had nothing to do with the decision to go to war. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because you can announce peace on television. You can post tough messages online. You can sell oil from emergency reserves to hide the pain for a few more weeks. But you cannot fake energy forever. You cannot fake cheap fuel. You cannot fake full reserves. And you cannot print your way out of a global supply shock. So the question is no longer just, will there be a deal with Iran? The real question is, if the deal collapses, does America still have enough economic strength to survive the war it is threatening to restart? Because if inflation rises, oil spikes, reserves drain, and China sits back with massive energy stockpiles, then this is no longer diplomacy. This is a gamble with the global economy.
In April, U.S. inflation increased from up to 3.8% from 3.2%. Right now, this war is leading to inflation projections for the second quarter of roughly 6%. Now, if that's true, and I think it probably is, that means our interest rates should be at about 7%. But that would be catastrophic for us. And so they're being artificially suppressed and held at about 3.75%. So what are we in really doing right now? We're sort of watching the edifice of our security architecture, our diplomatic strategy, all sort of sink into the abyss. Now, why is this happening? When we first started this war, we ended up taking 13 million barrels of oil off the market every day. If we restart the war against Iran, that is, we go back in and start hammering Iran from the air and from the sea with all the missiles and bombs that we can accumulate, Iran says it will counterattack and remove an estimated 25 million barrels out of the global market. Now, we have 374 million barrels in our strategic petroleum reserve. 25 million barrels are held in Oklahoma, I think in Cushing. The rest tend to be largely in Texas and Louisiana along the borders. Right now, we know that President Trump has sold 17.8 million barrels this last week from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at a price below market rates. That means lower oil prices below $110 per barrel. Now, what's this done? Well, this has helped him to manipulate the oil market in a way that insulates U.S. users of fuel from the real impact of the Iran war. This manipulation at its current rate will drain our strategic petroleum reserve in roughly 60 days. So let's do the math. That means by the end of July, we're staring at an empty strategic petroleum reserve. Now, then let's turn to China. China is 86% self-sufficient in oil, but it still has a 14% shortfall. Those shortfalls are being made up by various countries, including Saudi Arabia, mostly Russia, and some others. So they're not in a dangerous position whatsoever. They've stockpiled oil. They have the largest petroleum reserve in the world, 1.3 billion barrels in above ground storage. That means they could all be extracted. Now, let's go back and understand what else is happening, because we tend to see the Ukraine war and what's happening there as completely separate and distinct from what's going on in the Persian Gulf. And that's not really true. In 2022, at the start of the Ukraine war, 3 million barrels were taken off the global economy per day. This drove the oil price at that point initially up to $120 per barrel. Today, right now, the United Kingdom and our European allies are providing drone components and targeting data to the Ukrainians so that they can attack refineries and other oil infrastructure inside Russia. This has been successful insofar as it has reduced the numbers of millions of barrels per day by 13 million from the global supply. At this rate, what are the long-term implications? We're going to watch the global economy shrink by an estimated 36%. Now, just for referential purposes, the Great Depression reduced the world economy by 20%. However, the effects of the Great Depression were mitigated by much lower debt to GDP ratios that currently prevail in the United States and Europe. What happens if we lose, say, an estimated 30% of global productivity? Well, this is effectively a global depression. We're going to be part of that. So to talk in a cavalier fashion about, well, we'll go down and bomb these people into the Stone Age, we'll bomb them until they agree to go along with us, and you're staring at 6% inflation projections for the second quarter, I think we're bordering on insanity. This is irresponsible on a scale that I cannot imagine. I don't know of any similar action that any president, king, or emperor in the last 300 years has taken that would compare to the irresponsible approach that we've taken to the Gulf and also towards Russia in the Ukraine war. I urge people in the audience who want to understand this, you've got to go to people like Luke Roman, to Gundlach, Ray Dalio, and Peter Schiff. All of these people are essentially depicting what I just said in even more profound terms. I'm just trying to understand the oil and gas markets. Now, when you start talking about everything else that we're missing, sulfuric acid, without sulfuric acid, you can't refine anything. That puts the copper industry in a terrible position. You can't refine uranium. I mean, we just go down the list. It's disastrous. And that's just a snapshot. That's the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And at the same time, we're riding here in the United States on something akin to the Titanic that is already partially underwater. That's our economy and the financial system. That's the point. What can we do to get out of this? And frankly, we're not going to escape all the consequences at this point. But if he were to shut down everything right now and simply say, that's it, we cannot go on because this has humanitarian consequences for the entire world. As president of the United States, I am obligated to suspend further combat operations. We're still talking about months before the oil redistribution recovers. And even then, you're looking about 2 or 3 years to rebuild a lot of this infrastructure that's being destroyed. So what we're really talking about, if he goes back to war the way he did before with our forces, is Armageddon. And the idea that the man with his finger on the button for Armageddon is not really Trump, but Bibi Netanyahu, is even more disturbing. Secretary of State Rubio is conveying the impression that somehow or another, miraculously, our views align with the rest of the world, or the rest of the world's views align with us on the subject of the Persian Gulf, and specifically this issue of tolls. Right now, if you look at the polling data that's available, but all you have to do is listen to the leaders and their public statements, the world holds us responsible for shutting down the Gulf. That needs to be understood. They are not blaming Iran for shutting down the Gulf. Everyone understands that it makes sense for Iran strategically to do what it has done. That doesn't mean they like it. Are they opposed to it? Of course. but they blame us for it. This is very important.
This is where the Iran crisis becomes bigger than diplomacy, because on the surface, everyone is talking about a deal. Trump says negotiations are moving. Washington says there is a framework. Officials talk about ceasefires, memorandums, uranium, inspections, and the Strait of Hormuz. But underneath all of that, there is a much more dangerous question. What happens if the deal collapses? Because if this war restarts, it will not just be measured in missiles, targets, and military briefings. It will be measured in oil barrels, inflation numbers, interest rates, food prices, fuel shortages, and the pressure ordinary families feel every single month. That is the part Washington does not want to explain clearly, because a war with Iran is not like a small strike on a weak country. Iran sits beside one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. If the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, the shock does not stay in the Persian Gulf. It moves through the entire global economy. Oil moves first, then diesel, then shipping, then fertilizer, then food, then inflation. And eventually, the cost reaches the people who had no seat at the table when this crisis was created. That is why the oil math matters so much. If energy becomes expensive, everything becomes expensive. Trucks cannot move goods without fuel. Farms cannot produce cheaply without fertilizer. Factories cannot run without power. Airlines cannot operate without jet fuel. Ships cannot move safely through contested waters without insurance costs exploding. So when leaders talk casually about bombing Iran again, they are not just talking about military pressure. They are talking about raising the cost of living across the world. And this is where the argument becomes very serious. The transcript points to inflation already moving higher, with projections rising sharply if the war expands. In a normal economy, higher inflation would push interest rates higher. But higher interest rates would create another problem: debt. The United States is already carrying a massive debt burden. If rates rise too much, borrowing becomes more expensive, businesses struggle, markets panic, and the government itself faces a much heavier interest bill. So Washington is trapped. If it raises rates to fight inflation, it risks breaking the economy. If it keeps rates low, inflation can keep eating people alive. And if war pushes oil higher again, the entire problem gets worse. That is the real danger. This is not just a foreign policy crisis. This is a financial trap. And to hide the pressure, the government can release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That may calm prices for a short time. It may make the public feel like fuel costs are still under control. But a reserve is called a reserve for a reason. It is not endless. You can drain emergency oil for a few weeks. You can soften the shock temporarily. You can buy political time. But you cannot build a long-term strategy on emptying your backup tank while threatening another war in the most sensitive energy region on Earth. And then there is China. This is the part that should worry American strategists. China can sit back, watch the crisis, protect its own reserves, and let Washington burn through its emergency supply while global anger shifts toward the United States. That is not a small advantage, because power today is not only aircraft carriers and missiles. Power is energy security. Power is industrial depth. Power is the ability to absorb a shock while your rival bleeds financially. And right now, if America restarts a war in the Gulf while still dealing with Ukraine, inflation, debt, and political division at home, the question becomes very uncomfortable. Is Washington stretching itself beyond what it can actually sustain? This is why the comparison to previous wars does not work. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is a large country with a serious military, deep alliances, strategic geography, and the ability to impose costs far beyond its borders. You can strike Iran, but can you control what happens after? Can you control oil prices? Can you control shipping? Can you control inflation? Can you control China's response? Can you control public anger when fuel and food become more expensive? That is the problem with escalation. Leaders often imagine the first move. They imagine the strike, the headline, the speech, the show of strength. But the second move belongs to the other side. And the third move belongs to the market. That is where wars become impossible to manage.